Thank you very much, Dr. Welker. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk to this learned and academic audience. Sometimes those of us who go around and talk are confronted with less sophisticated audiences, and we, particularly if you're going to talk about something scientific, you have a rather hard time. I was lecturing recently to a ladies' club, which will remain anonymous, and after I got through, this gushing lady came up and wringing her hands and said, "Oh, Mr. Sullivan, your lecture was absolutely superfluous." And I sort of backed off for a minute and thought, well, I'll have to come with some sort of comeback. So I said, well, as a matter of fact, I'm rather proud of it. I'm hoping it will be published posthumously. He said, "Oh, it couldn't be too soon." Well, if you know, as I look at this audience and think of the year 2000 and some of the things that I'm going to discuss this evening, it's a rather awesome thought to realize that a large percentage of our audience this evening will be younger than I am in the year 2000. You'll be entering into the 21st century in the prime of your lives, confronted with some of the situations and problems that we'll discuss this evening. And of course, it's lots of fun to talk about the future. It's sort of become a hobby of people big and small, learned and unlearned. In the last few years, things are moving so extraordinarily rapidly. In fact, man is confronted with a situation that since he first evolved on this planet has never confronted him. Because the world in which we live today is utterly different from the world in which our fathers, much less our grandfathers, grew up. And yet our grandfathers grew up in a world that really wasn't very different from the world in which their grandfathers lived. And our great-great-grandfathers lived in a world that was very little changed even from a century before. So that man has not, in this sense, been aware of change until very, very recently. And yet today it is obvious that these young people who will be around here in the year 2000 and 2001 will be living in a world utterly different than the one in which they are living today and in which they are being educated today. I remember there's a saying of Asoka Mehta, who was the Minister of Planning in India, that until now, when you educated the new generation, you could give them a map to guide them through life. But today, all we can hope to do is to give them a compass. And that is the situation in 1969. Well, if we're going to talk about the year 2000, of course, we can have a lot of fun dreaming and trying to look ahead a little bit. But that would be a distortion of the situation unless we considered that there are some very grim possibilities too. And what I'd like to do would be to sort of get the grim possibilities out of the way first and then go on to discuss some of the other more hopeful possibilities. Because indeed, as Bobby Burns said, forward though I cannot see, I guess and fear. And so indeed we cannot see truthfully into the future, but we see various possibilities. We hear dire predictions of famine by the end of the century, not in this country, but in the emerging countries whose populations are growing so much more rapidly than their means of food production. And to overcome this danger will indeed be an enormous task, because the entire country must be lifted up by its economic bootstraps. The transportation system must be developed so that the food can be moved from the agricultural to the urban areas, so that the fertilizer can be moved from the factory or the seaport to the farm. And above all, the basic social fabric of the country must be changed from a primitive or medieval or agrarian barter type of social structure to a modern money economy. In India, for example, the farmer from time immemorial has been used to living a life in which money played very little role. He was not used to going out and buying fertilizer or anything else for that matter. It was a barter type of economy, and now, even though you can ship fertilizer into the bigger rural marketing centers, to get it from there onto the land is an enormous social problem. And yet the population continues to grow because, again, these inborn social traditions take hold. If a man was having children, a man and his wife were bearing children, these were their guarantee for security in their old age. There was no society equipped to care for them as they got older. The only people they could hope would watch out for them as they got old and feeble were their stalwart sons. And since the death rate was enormous, they had to have 8, 9, or 10 children in order to have even a modest assurance that one son would survive to run the farm to keep them alive in their old age. Now, of course, one of the easiest things to do in the emerging parts of the world is to bring in modern public health practices so that the infant mortality goes plunging way down, the death rate goes down, but the birth rate still stays very high. So you have the possibility of famine arising from all of these factors. Also disease. In spite of the fact that we are becoming so sophisticated in dealing with disease, as the population grows, the possibility of pandemic, of global epidemic, becomes more and more severe. The Asian flu, the Hong Kong flu, is but one example of a rather mild type of virus that with jet travel and so forth can sweep through an unprepared population. Some of you may recall that at the end of World War I, 20 million people were killed by the flu epidemic of that time, all through the world. It was one of the great epidemics of all time, and it was just flu, nothing more serious than that. And yet last year in Germany, there was a very horrifying episode that occurred where in, I think it was Stuttgart, several people came to a hospital with a very strange disease that put them into a coma within hours, and within a few days they had died. And they found that the one thing these people all had in common was that they were laboratory workers who had been working with green monkeys in culturing, I think they were culturing viruses or something, using the green monkeys for some kind of medical work. Then the people in another city began to die in this peculiar way, and they too had been working with green monkeys. So then they began to look into this very vigorously, of course. They discovered that all of these green monkeys had come in one shipment from, I think it was India, and they surmised that the infectious agent had come from one of those green monkeys, who then gave it to the others, who then gave it to these people. This was such a potent virus that when they took the contaminated tissue to the laboratory for study and culture, the only place they felt it was safe to work with it was the biological warfare laboratories of the British at Portnoy, because there they were equipped to handle something as lethal as this. Well, imagine, and this virus has now been isolated. It's a unique virus that suddenly appeared. As the population density grows, of course, our vulnerability to this kind of episode on a global scale becomes greater and greater. However, and of course the most serious fear of all, the one we're all tired of hearing about really, is the danger of nuclear war. I don't know how many of you have heard Flanders and Swan, that wonderful British singing and talking comedy team, but they have a very nice song that they sing. Well, I shouldn't say a very nice song, but it's a song they sing to the refrain of 10,000 pounds, what is it, no? 10 tons of TNT, that's it. 10 tons of TNT, that is the nuclear yield of all the weapons in all the arsenals of the great powers in the world per capita. For every man, woman, and child in the world, there's a nice little kitty of 10 tons nuclear explosion equivalent. Well, hopefully this will never be used in a global war. But such are the dangers that we face, and the problem is to develop the wisdom, the techniques, the knowledge that we need to cope with these dangers. As I said, the looking ahead has become a sort of a new science. Some people call it futurology. And men of great distinction like Glenn Seaborg, the chairman of our Atomic Energy Commission, and others who are concerned at the enormously rapid pace of our technological and scientific growth, have put their minds to this problem of trying to see where we're going and trying to see if we can agree on some long-range goals as to where we really want to go. The paths I've just described are obviously the ones we don't want to travel, but what are the ones we do want to travel? There's a group in Minnesota that is working on a wonderful idea for an experimental city that would be like no city that has ever existed on Earth. Leaders of this group include Athelstan Spielhaus, who's head of the Franklin Institute, now in Philadelphia, but for years was head of the Geophysical Institute at the University of Minnesota. Bernard Schriever, who was the commanding general of the Air Force Systems Command, who's a great man on systems analysis. And I think Buckminster Fuller, the man who has designed those fantastic geodesic domes. And these men have got together and designed what they think would be the ideal city. Their argument is that urban renewal is to some extent a waste of time, that the cities of our world have evolved for reasons, they have evolved in the first place at locations whose justification has become obsolete. The mode of their evolution is out of date. Their transportation systems, the whole concept of the city was determined by a history that is no longer applicable. And so they, with federal financing, have gone ahead and designed a city of the future that indeed they hope can be started in the near future in a rural part of Minnesota. And the idea would be that ultimately one of these cities would be built in each state as a prototype, the site picked for its amenities, its scenic beauty, its accessibility too, but accessibility of course becomes much less of a problem with modern highways and airlines. So let's just think about this city a little bit. Some of you perhaps know Spielhaus through his comic strip. He does all kinds of wild things, and one of them is that he does a comic strip that appears in a number of papers that is sort of a futuristic comic strip. And this city of the future is indeed that. It would look a little bit like Habitat. Those of you who went to the Expo 67 in Montreal will remember that remarkable modular structure housing development on the island there that was simply a lot of units piled up in sort of fascinating patterns. Each little unit was a home with its own yard, its own access by ramps and sidewalks, and yet this whole thing could be put together from prefabricated units in any way that you wanted, so to speak. This city is to be built in much the same way. There will be no traffic on the streets, no automobile traffic. All the fume-producing traffic will come in underground. The city will be built from underground up, so to speak. That is, before the city has even started. These underground streets will be laid in, only main arteries. All the transport within the city will be by other means. From these underground highways, the fumes will be drawn out, as will all other fumes, by fume sewers. And these fume sewers will draw the fumes to scrubbing plants on the outskirts of the city, so that what is discharged into the atmosphere will not be a pollutant. Travel within the city will be by some sort of electrical vehicle, probably a little bit like the cars that you ride around in sometimes in an amusement park where you get into the car and something is activated and it goes tearing off. Only in this case, you go down into the basement of your apartment house where these little cars would be sitting, and you'd look up in your little book where you wanted to go. It might be R.H. Macy department store or something like that. So you'd look up in your little book the code number of the department store, which would be 2168. So on the little dashboard, you'd punch out the numbers 2168 on the push buttons, and the little car would begin to jiggle. The system would activate it. The car would slip out onto rails automatically, and you'd go down through little tunnels across ramps. You'd come onto other tracks automatically, pre-programmed. You'd be switched onto these different tracks and go past other cars and everything, all automatic controlled. No traffic accidents, no fumes. You finally discover you switched off into a siding in the basement of Macy's department store. You go about your business and come home the same way. When buildings are built in the city, there's no excavation in the streets, no cluttering of the streets with construction equipment. The buildings are formed of prefabricated units that are brought in through these underground highways, and the building rises up from underground, serves its useful life of 20 or 30 years, and when it's outmoded, it just disappears back into the ground again. It's taken apart and the unit's taken out and some new structure put up in its place. Well, this is the wonderful world of the experimental city. As I said, Glenn Seaborg, who's head of the Atomic Energy Commission, last year decided that the AEC should begin to look ahead at what the world might be like in the year 2000, so he put his men to work. And naturally, they foresaw a world powered primarily by atomic energy, hopefully by fusion energy, but if not by fission energy. You remember that fission energy is the conventional atomic bomb process where the atom is split, where you use uranium or plutonium as fuel, and fusion would be if we could use one of the hydrogen isotopes as fuel. But in any case, these atomic centers would be remote from the cities. Electric power would be, they hope, so inexpensive that a revolution in industrial technology could take place. Metal refining would be done by electrostatic processes rather than by other chemical processes now used. And waste products from the city would be brought in and broken down. Of course, instead of dumping your wastes into a dump or out at sea, particularly in view of dwindling natural resources, you would bring all of the refuse from the city into these plants where electrostatically and chemically it would be separated into its components so that it could be reused. This same problem arose. This kind of problem would eliminate the dumping of waste in the ocean and, of course, the polluting of our cities with dumps that smoke and attract gulls and all that sort of thing. Also, in this program for the year 2000, Seaborg envisioned a trip to Muncie from New York that would run somewhat as follows. As I did this morning, I would get not into my gasoline car, but into a small electric car at my home in Connecticut, drive to the station, turn the car in at the station, and never see it again because the car belonged to the transport authority. When I came home later, I would simply pick the next car off the line out of the lot so there'd be no fussing with cars in and out of the parking lot. You always just take the first car off the line. You don't own the car. You're charged a certain price per month for this service. Banking is done not by paperwork, but by computer techniques with a printout system in your home so that at the end of the month your bank account is printed out on the computer printout in your home instead of coming through the mail. And at any time that you want to find out what your bank balance is, you just interrogate the system and it tells you. However, as I say, you turn in your car at the railroad station, you get on a high-speed train, and get to the airport, get in one of the big jumbo jets with 500 other people, and get off at Indianapolis and go to the rental car counter. I must say, due to the hospitality of this university, I didn't have to do this, but normally you would go to the rent-a-car counter, but unfortunately there would no longer be a pretty girl there to hand you the keys and check you out in a car. You would simply put your credit card into a slot in the counter and then lay your hand on a glass plate, and automatically the system would compare the print on your palm with a microfilmed print of your palm on the credit card, and if it matched, a little key would pop out of the receptacle below. You would then go into the parking lot and pick up your car and drive to Muncie and do your work and drive back, turn the car in, turn the keys in, and the whole thing, of course, would be automatically accounted and put onto your account at the end of the month, return home the same way. And the only thing is, at the end of the month, you would get your accounting, and you'd notice that not only had you been charged mileage for the drive from Indianapolis to Muncie, but you'd also been fined $10 for speeding as you went through Carbondale down the road. The reason being that your car has an automatic sensor that knows what the speed limit is at any point on the way, and if you exceed the speed limit, it's automatically recorded and you're fined accordingly. Well, this, of course, raises the whole bogey of privacy. What is going to happen to our privacy at the end of the century? Because medicine would run something like this. You'd go to the local group practice clinic and walk in, and here there would be a pretty girl at the desk, and you'd ask to see the doctor and explain that you had a pain in the lumbar vertebrae of your back, and she'd say, now what's your social security number? And you'd give that to her, and she'd punch that on a little punch board in front of her, and then she'd say, now you say fourth lumbar vertebra pain, and she'd look it up in the book, fourth lumbar vertebra pain, and it has a code number, and she punches that into the keyboard, and then she asks for other symptoms. Well, I don't seem to sleep very well at night. I wake up about 3 o'clock every morning. Well, she looks that up and punches that into the system, and then there's just a fraction of a second's delay, and this machine quickly prints out the patient's name is so-and-so, his medical history is on file at the National Medical Records Archive at Bethesda, Maryland, and the symptoms that he described at this moment are very similar to those he described when he was stricken in Detroit last year. I went to a local clinic there. We think this traces back to a football injury in his third year in high school. At that time, he was x-rayed and so on. You see, the whole medical history is on file at Bethesda. Who here among the adults can remember whether they had mumps when they were small, and if so, on which side? But with this kind of medical record keeping, this kind of information would be available, centralized, reliable. The best medical talent could be brought to bear on cases that needed it. Electrocardiograms and encephalograms and so forth could be transmitted to specialists or even to computers who could read them for the characteristic symptoms of whatever might ail the patient. The patient would see his doctor once in a while, but more likely on the golf course than anywhere else. Well, certainly some privacy will be forfeited by this kind of a system, so that the challenge, and we're going to run into a number of challenges as we progress in this discussion of the future, the challenge will be to devise ways, and I believe they can be devised, whereby we can have the benefit of this kind of service without forfeiting the privacy that we treasure. There is a huge printing plant in Chicago that prints all kinds of national magazines. These are competitive, highly competitive magazines. This building has more security guards in it practically than the Pentagon. because, and I'm going to identify magazines without knowing that they're actually the ones, but there's the Look magazine section over here, and the Life magazine section here, and Holiday here, and Sports Illustrated here. And all these people are working for the big company that does this high quality color printing. But the security regulations are so strict that sometimes Time and Newsweek will come out with exactly the same cover, published the same week by the same company, but the part of the company that does one thing doesn't know that the same thing is being done by the other company. And of course the two magazines are furious because they both came out with a picture of Teddy Kennedy or something on the cover. I cite this only to show that if you want to, you can take extraordinary measures to guard your privacy, even though you are taking advantage of many of the tricks of modern technology. Well, then in medicine, of course, we will have much more than we have today in the way of transplants. And this conjures up all kinds of awesome thoughts. As you know, Boris Karloff died this week. Wonderful old Boris Karloff. And we all remember him, of course, as the monster that Dr. Frankenstein constructed. Dr. Frankenstein made his monster out of parts taken from newly deceased people. I think when that story was written a good part of a century ago, it never occurred to the authoress that this might indeed someday be a possibility. But today, it does seem possible that someday we will have chimeras, human chimeras, as today already we have animal chimeras. And an animal chimera is an animal that is part one species and part another. A dog with a pig's leg and a wolf's tail or something like that. I have visited, well, in the first place, as you know, the great problem in heart transplants is that the body rejects alien tissue. We have this marvelous system for defending ourselves against invading bacteria and invading viruses, this immune system, and it's also very efficient at protecting us, unfortunately, from tissue that may be donated to us by some other individual, whether it be a skin graft to cover a wound, a bad burn, or a kidney or a heart or anything else. But it would appear that eventually we're going to learn what it is, how this system works, and be able to control it. And then probably the most abundant source of hearts for human beings who need new ones will be pigs. The pig's heart is very similar in size and capability of function to that of the human being. And imagine how startling it will be if you call somebody a pig-hearted fool, and he'll sort of back off and say, but I do have a pig's heart. And think of all the religious implications that would arise for people who discovered that their only chance of survival was to spend the rest of their lives with a pig's heart. Well, last summer I had a fascinating visit at Oxford University because I'd heard about the work of John Gurdon there, whose implications are absolutely awesome for the future. This is a man at Oxford who is working with frogs, and he has discovered a way to produce frogs from body cells. Now, as you know, normal reproduction is done, that is, bisexual reproduction of all the higher organisms, is done by two half cells, so to speak, a sperm and an egg, each with a half quota of of genes, of chromosomes, comes together, unites to form a complete individual, a fertile egg that then grows into a new individual. And yet there had long been a suspicion that in every cell of our body, at least every cell that has a nucleus, there was which is virtually every cell, there was a complete plan of the body. Each cell, for example, a skin cell, one skin cell off your skin would have in its nucleus all of you, your characteristics, the instructions for the chemistry of your life processes, your capabilities, your weaknesses, and insofar as they were inborn. But there was something in that skin cell that told the nucleus, you are the nucleus of a skin cell, and you're not allowed to do anything else. All you can do is to make that cell, because the nucleus is what controls its activity, you make that cell do the things it's supposed to do as a skin cell. And yet there was always a suspicion. This seemed incredible, at least to me when I heard it, and I never really believed it until Gurdon did this work. But the question was, would there be some way to take a skin cell and say to its nucleus, you're no longer the nucleus of a skin cell, you are now going to be a new man, and start growing into a new man. This, in effect, is what Gurdon has done with the frog. He's done it with cells taken from the intestines of tadpoles. The intestinal lining, the epithelium of the intestine, is a very rapidly dividing kind of tissue. You know, the part of our body that lives the shortest time probably is the lining of our intestine. I've forgotten how many days it lasts on the average, but the turnover of the intestinal lining is extremely rapid, a matter of days. These are rapidly dividing cells, but in the tadpole, it's growing fast. They're even more rapidly dividing. So these are cells that have something in them, whose nature we still don't know, but there's something in those cells that makes them want to divide rapidly. So he takes one of those cells from the intestine of a tadpole, and then he takes a frog's egg from another frog, no relation, and he destroys the nucleus of that frog's egg, and he takes the nucleus out of the intestinal cell and puts it in the egg. Supposing that the intestinal cell came from a red frog and the egg came from a blue frog, so that the egg should grow into a blue frog. But he puts that nucleus from the intestine in there, and what happens? The egg grows into a red frog. Have I got my colors mixed up? Anyway, thank you. He shifts, you see, and in this way he can begin to mass produce frogs from other frogs without going through the normal reproductive process at all. And then as these eggs begin to subdivide, if he shakes them up a bit and breaks up the first cells that divide from the original egg cell, those can then be treated as new egg cells, so that from one egg cell he can make a number of other frogs. And he has pictures of dozens of these frogs, all from one frog, all from one body cell taken from one frog. What does that mean as far as human beings are concerned? It means that if we want to have a few thousand Sophia Lorens or a few thousand Brigitte Bardots, why not? You just take these body cells and start to reproduce them and culture them. Now, of course, Gurdon tears his hair when people talk like this, because he's not trying to make Brigitte Bardots or Sophia Lorens. He's not even sure that would be a good idea. What he's trying to do is to understand this mechanism that turns on and turns off the information that's in the nucleus of the cell, because this is critical to so many things. It's become a truism to say that it is one of the essential elements in cancer, but it certainly is. It's an essential element in this peculiar fact that the amphibians, like the salamanders and the axolotls and so on, these slimy little critters that run around in the water, if you cut off their leg, they just grow a new leg. Now, we all know if you cut off your arm or your leg, it'll never grow again. But there's some property that that little squirmy axolotl or that salamander has, or the lobster whose claw is pulled off, that enables him to grow a new one with all of the differentiated elements of that new leg or claw. But we can't do it. What is it that keeps us turned off and enables the salamander to turn on this reconstituting mechanism. Now, of course, as far as the human being is concerned, Gurdon pointed out that he used frogs because it's easy. It's still not very easy, but it's easier to do it with frogs. And it will be very difficult to do it with higher animals, because the frog's egg is a great, big, fat, rubbery egg. I hold my hands up like that. But what I really mean is that the frog's egg is big enough so, like a fish egg, you can see it. The human egg is so small that you virtually cannot see it with the naked eye, maybe just a tiny little speck. And it is very, very fragile. So that all this kind of manipulation that they do with the frog's egg, the other thing about the frog's egg is that the nucleus, instead of being in the middle, is out on the skin, on the edge. So that with a little squirt of ultraviolet light, you can just simply dissolve that nucleus. It disappears. And then what you do is to take that intestinal cell, and you take a little glass tube, what they call a pipette, and you suck the nucleus into the pipette. It keeps still a little bit of the meat of the cell, the cytoplasm, around the nucleus, because as soon as the nucleus is not enclosed in cytoplasm, it deteriorates. But you can suck out that nucleus with a little bit of cytoplasm around it and then squirt it into the egg that doesn't have a nucleus, and you're in business. But to do this with human cells, of course, would be extremely difficult. But still, we are moving towards the time when we can do genetic engineering, when we can begin to manipulate human heredity in various ways. For example, we know now that a number of human defects are inherited because of an improper chromosome structure in every cell of the body, dating back, of course, to the original egg cell. An extra chromosome, as you have a particular extra bundle of genetic material that you have that produces Mongolism, and other forms that also produce mental retardation, some that produce chemical errors in the body's function and its metabolism. One thought has been that since the virus, when you get a virus that gets into the body's cells, carrying with it a little bit of of its own genetic information, maybe someday we could make viruses that would enter the body cells and give to them what they were missing that caused the inherited defect. But that's rather far-fetched. But what we can do right now, when a woman is carrying a very small baby at a very, very early stage of development, is to withdraw some of the fluid from inside the uterus or from the placenta, some of the material from the placenta, and this, genetically speaking, is part of the baby. Genetically speaking, the placenta that carries the mother's blood and delivers it to the baby is the joining of the two circulatory systems. That tissue is part of the baby, genetically speaking. So if you can get some of it out by sticking a needle in and withdrawing just a tiny bit of it, you can then use that for a chromosomal analysis to see if there's any evidence of genetic defect. And then if you find that this is a defective fetus, you can decide or not decide to do something about it. Of course, this involves the ethical and religious issue of abortion. But as we begin to think about it, as we think that every cell of our body, in this sense, is a potential new individual, then our attitude towards abortion and towards many other related problems has to be adjusted accordingly. Because this, as I say, means that not only the newly fertilized egg of the human being, but every cell of the body, at least in the long-term sense, is a potential individual. So here again is another challenge for us to make ethical decisions in the future. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is the possibility that we may make contact with civilizations in other worlds. A book I've written on the subject deals with this possibility. This, of course, would be another enormous adjustment for our egos. It would be our last displacement from a special position in the universe if we finally receive some message that says we are not alone in the universe. Our displacement has been a slow and sometimes painful process that has gone on ever since the Renaissance, when at the dawn of the Renaissance we thought that our world was central, that our world was surrounded by a great globe of heaven which had little holes in it through which the holy fire beyond shone in the form of the stars, and then there was the sun, the moon, and the planets that wandered peculiar ways hither and yon. And it was only with the Renaissance and the Copernican revolution that we discovered that, well, we weren't central, but of course the sun was central. We go around the sun, and we're still unique life on this world that goes around this star at the center of the universe. And it's interesting that only in the lifetime of some of us here has it finally been shown that we are indeed very distant, finally shown, though long suspected, that we are very distant from the center of things. That we are, in fact, our sun is an average star, nowhere near the center of the spiral system of star clouds of which we call the Milky Way, and that star system, that galaxy, is itself but one among billions of other galaxies, each with its billions of suns and untold numbers of planets. Since the 200-inch telescope on Mount Palomar came into operation after World War II, it's been possible for every star that we can see in our own galaxy to look beyond and see another galaxy far beyond. So the number of stars and presumably the number of planets is virtually unlimited. It would seem arrogant of us to believe this is the only one on which there is life, probably the only one on which there is intelligent life. One of the exciting developments of the last year has been the discovery of the pulsars, these flashing objects in the sky. At first they were observed only in terms of radio pulsations, but this morning in the mail from the Lick Observatory in California, we got the first photograph of a pulsing star. And here this thing flashes 33 times a second, both in terms of radio pulses and light pulses. And of course, you can't see anything. People have been seeing this star for years. It's just a star up there, like those lights. How could you tell that really it's flashing 33 times a second? It's just like a movie. It's too fast for the eye to catch, too fast for a film to catch, too fast for any ordinary observing system to observe that instead of being a steady light, it's flashing 33 times a second. But now, using a sophisticated spinning disk and TV storage and retrieval kind of system, they have been able to photograph the individual flashes and show that 1 fraction of a second there's a star there, and a 1/33 of a second later there is none, because it's flashing on and off. Now, what are these things? Shklovsky, when I visited the Sternberg Observatory in Moscow a few years ago, we were discussing this problem of signaling between civilizations. He said the civilizations in our galaxy are so remote from one another that they will never try to contact us by aiming a radio antenna at us and sending a message, because the chances that they would ever aim it in the right direction to reach anybody would be incredibly small. What they will do would be to construct beacons that will attract our attention. Are these beacons? We know about 20 or 30 of them now, since they were discovered, as I say, about a year ago. But it would seem probably not. It seems more likely that they are very dense objects spinning very rapidly called neutron stars, but we really don't know what they are yet. And it would seem possible that before the end of this century we will have confirmed the existence of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. Well, also very likely that we will have synthesized something that we could say was alive. We can have created life, if you want to put it that way. But George Wald, who's professor of biology at Harvard, who has followed and contributed to this long discussion of how life originated on the earth, has discussed this question of the squeamishness that people have when they are told that there are men in white coats in a laboratory who are trying to create life, because they have pushed this research into chemical evolution to the point where it seems evident now that the chemistry of life is built into the chemistry of the universe, that given the right conditions, the inorganic, simple chemistry evolves slowly, step by step, from the very simple chemistry to the more complex chemistry, and finally to that form of chemical process whereby a unit draws nourishment from its environment, produces energy from it, reproduces itself, transfers to its offspring the information needed, the pattern, the blueprint, so that the offspring can do what it did. If this is the definition of life, it would appear that this does arise spontaneously whenever the conditions are right, here and on all those other planets. And so Wald says, we're not going to create life. All we're going to do and are doing today is to learn how life originated, the conditions under which it originated. We will then happily create those conditions in the laboratory, and then we will stand aside and watch while life creates itself. One of the things that will be certainly, assuming we don't blow ourselves up by the end of the century, one of the problems will be, we're already facing it, an awful lot of leisure. And what will happen to man as his leisure continues to increase? Will we, as von Herner of Germany has proposed, just become sort of jellyfish sitting in front of the boob tube all day, drawing our food out of some kind of automatic gadget that squirts it out at us like the astronauts going around the moon? Everything automated, even super thought machines to do our homework for us, as well as do the chores that we hope the computers will do. Or will our leisure have quite a different effect? I remember, I think of the wonderful cathedrals of Europe built during the Middle Ages by cities that were competing with one another to produce the most marvelous symbol of their town's pride and culture and faith. Everybody in the town did something to make that cathedral beautiful as he could, as the town could. Some of them carved funny little figures that went into the arches over the doors. Some of them contributed to the cutting of the stone. Some of them just gave money. Some of them produced the really artistic parts of the cathedral. And I think that even when I was going to college and drove out the Merritt Parkway from New York, which they were building at the time, there was still an effort to do something with those bridges that went over. They carried all the Westchester and Fairfield County roads across the highway. Each bridge is different. One has iron grill work with grapes worked into it, and another one. Some of them are quite hideous, but at least there was an attempt to be different, to be creative, to make the world a little bit more beautiful. And what do we see now when we drive down the highway? Pizza parlors and filling stations and motels, helter-skelter, no effort at planning, at making ours a beautiful, pleasant kind of a world in which to live. But people aren't going to stand for that. And I think as our leisure increases and as our wealth increases, as we no longer have to buy the tiniest 5 and dime thing to keep up with the Joneses, but we can then begin to think about quality, quality in the goods we use, quality in the lives that we live, quality in the utilities around us. Then those throughway bridges that by today are completely standardized will suddenly begin to change, and people will begin to use their leisure time to bring more beauty into our world, into their homes, and into the world around us. Well, in order to give us a little bit of time to have a discussion afterwards and let some of you escape who want to escape, let me summarize by saying that the real thing about the year 2000 is that you are going to be faced with decisions of a formidable kind, decisions that no human generation has ever had to face. We get a taste of them already. Weather control. You know, this winter they've been trying to control snowfall around the rim of Lake Erie, the southeastern rim, the Buffalo snow belt, which gets these heavy snows. This wind comes down off of Canada and blows across the lake. It picks up this humidity. As soon as it hits the land and rises a bit, it dumps 3 feet of snow in a few hours on that part of the country. And then a little bit further to the east, there are the Adirondacks and all those ski resorts. And what they've been doing is to try seeding some sections of these storms with particles that will produce, instead of some big snowflakes, produce a whole lot of little particles that will be too light to fall until they get much further inland. Well, it's a tricky thing to do. The ski people say, but you're going to ruin the skiing because the snow won't fall on Buffalo and it won't fall on the Adirondacks. It'll fall in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and we'll go bust. So they've been fighting the weather control. What's going to happen when we get even better at weather control? When we can say, it's been a dry year in Indiana, so we're going to send our seeding planes up from Indianapolis Airport, and as soon as that cloud comes over the Ohio River, we're going to turn it on and drop water all over Indiana. And then the people up in Illinois are going to say, "Joe, you're robbing all our rain from us." Who's going to decide who gets the rain? And in this genetic manipulation, who is going to say who are the best people if we come to the point where we're going to decide, when we're really going to manipulate genetics? It seems to me quite possible that we will put that one off for a long, long time. I was talking to Ed Teller a few weeks ago about this Sophia Loren bit and saying, it really, we'll never do it. And he said, well, now, don't be so sure. Ed Teller always takes the other point of view when you're talking with him. He's a nuclear physicist. And he said, if I had a son, a young son whom I loved, and he was killed suddenly in an accident, how wonderful it would be if I knew that I could then have my son back. Some years younger, but still genetically, identically, that same wonderful person whom I loved so much. Well, perhaps so. But we are also approaching the time medically when we can keep people alive much, much longer than ever before. I noticed that Salazar in Portugal, whom we all thought had reached the end of his days, has returned home. I think it was yesterday. Medicine has gotten to the point where if somebody is important enough, they can keep him alive for a long, long time, and it won't be long before we can keep an awful lot of people alive almost indefinitely until they really get up to be around 100. So who are we going to keep alive? Who is worth keeping alive? How long should we keep them alive? Supposing the people who are looking into this process of aging discover what it really is. We don't know what it is that makes us grow old. Here we have this wonderful system inside the cells in which one cell, when it gets old and tired, simply produces another cell that's identical, that goes on doing the job, and there's no reason why anything should go wrong with this process, and yet there's something systematic that goes on in our bodies that makes us grow old and finally die. It's very interesting that this process of mortality is tied to sex. For those organisms that do not reproduce sexually, life is, in a sense, immortal. Because if they reproduce by subdivision, that little amoeba subdivides, and at least half of them, or both halves, can be considered to be a continuation of the previous individual. If an amoeba had consciousness and memory, one half or both halves would remember what had gone on in his previous incarnation. And when he subdivides, same thing, ad infinitum. And this is true of all the organisms that subdivide, reproduce by subdivision. But of course, in the case of sexual reproduction, the only thing that is immortal in this sense is the germ plasm. That mixes as you go from generation to generation. The genes mix, but there it goes on and on. But for this process to work, the parents have to die. And it is one of the spookier things about nature that this is indeed programmed into all of us. Death is programmed inevitably into all organisms that reproduce by sexual reproduction. And you're never going to see anybody today anyway who live beyond 100 or 120 years or something of that sort. But supposing we learn a way around that. Do we want to live in a world with no children? I don't want to live in a world with no children. But if we are to retain a uniform population and we have virtual immortality except for people who get squashed by steamrollers or something and can't be put back together again, we have to have a world with practically no children. They'll be like things in the zoo that you go and look at. Well, what some of the scientists are saying today, and I heard one say this yesterday or the day before, it's as though we were going to have to play God to make decisions that men have never had to make before. And that is a pretty frightening thought, because some of the decisions we make are irrevocable. There's no turning back. When we decided to go in for the automobile as our, and it wasn't a real decision, it just sort of happened, at least not a decision with all of the consequences envisioned. When we decided to go in for automobiles as our way of getting around, then we built superhighways, the interstate highway system. The whole of our civilization is committed to the automobile as the prime means of transportation. And in a sense, there's no turning back from that decision. We can modify it. We can perhaps shift to the electric car. But still, this was an irrevocable decision in this sense. Of course, the most irrevocable decision of all would be to go to war with nuclear weapons, because that, if it wiped out all of life, would indeed be irrevocable. One of the speakers at the meeting of the American Physical Society in New York this week was Gerald Feinberg, who's professor of physics at Columbia. And he spoke on the subject of his book just out called The Prometheus Project, in which he argues that nature rules by laws, but it does not plan. And that we've been able to get along so far without really planning our long-term goals, but that is no longer possible. And that all the nations and peoples of the world are going to have to get together and plan where we really want to go, even to the point, he says, of deciding whether or not we will ultimately send forth expeditions to try to populate some of the planets in other planetary systems beyond our own. Finally, I'm reminded of a remark made by John Platt, who's professor of biophysics and physics at the University of Chicago. And it's apropos, it's an answer to those who say the dreams of those who would plan, who would change the world, who are dissatisfied with the way things are being run today, are naive and unrealistic. Platt said, "The world has become too dangerous for anything except utopias." Thank you very much.